So now with increased awareness of the problems we're facing on our projects, let's move along to something. Well, what do we do about it? So John's going to discuss how to sharpen the focus on handoffs during weekly planning conversations. I think you're going to find this really insightful. John is a principal at Collaborative Flow. He has been a pioneer in bringing innovative thinking to the EPC industry with a passion for workplace safety, innovation, and smooth flow. Many years of job site and corporate construction operations leadership, combined with extensive study and research of project delivery systems, led to a series of breakthrough projects that he's worked on. Has introduced lean thinking to countless teams and led 3 major clients as they transformed their project delivery organizations. And he's also currently the co-chair on the joint working group supported by the Lean Construction Institute, Construction Industry Institute, and the Project Production Institute. So getting to know John really well. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you and I'll be back for the Q&A. And I'm glad to see people are starting to use the chat function for Q&A. Just one reminder, keep dropping them in there and we'll handle your questions.
Great deal. Well, yeah, I'm going to be talking about something that may be so blindingly obvious that we haven't seen it for years. So I'm going to, thinking back to a classic folk song from the 60s, I think we need to look at handoffs from both sides now and focus on the ones that matter the most. And so I want to start, though, with the safety moment we do sometimes, but this one we'll see is very applicable. Psychological safety is basically a familiar concept to a lot of you, but it's basically saying, hey, people can speak up without fear of retribution. They can say what the problems are. They can talk about the problems we talked about in the last conversation without being squashed. And this all came out of Project Aristotle, which was about how to get great team performance. And they found, hey, more than anything else, psychological safety was what's critical. And one of the points we'll make here is if you're going to go propose this kind of stuff and propose these thinkings, you better have some psychological courage because you're going to bring things up. People are going to shoot at you a bit, and you need to be prepared for that as you start talking about things that kind of start seeming obvious once you understand some of the operations science principles. So maybe these are just hypothetical situations, kind of like we heard on the last conversation. Does this happen on your project? But do you ever, either on projects or even in your personal life, you put a ton of extra work into something? You may have worked all weekend on a report or all weekend on an analysis, skipped your daughter's soccer game, and then nobody used it. Or not much of it was used at all. Or, hey, maybe people are doing more work than was needed to support the next task or the next decision. You worked way ahead. You made it more complete. And the effect of that was the downstream folks had to wait for what they needed, while you were working on what they didn't. And then you find out that much of the things changed and you had to redo a lot of it anyway. Maybe you've done a whole bunch of work. You thought it was done, that then you found mistakes and you had to do it over because the downstream customer couldn't use it as they expected. And then maybe at a corporate level, lots of initiatives were launched within language until their eventual demise. And I worked for one company that I was convinced needed a WIP limit on initiatives. For those of you who are into the lean construction type things, you might have another question. It's like, why is my PPC improving, but I'm not making the progress that I expected? Well, I think a couple of things here I'll talk about might help explain that. And so the last planner system was designed to help explain some of this. And I'll talk about some of the early concepts. And that was to, hey, let's get the folks closest to the work. Probably the most radical concept was performing the work at the pull of the downstream performer at the last responsible moment. And we'll talk more about last responsible moment, but giving them what they need when they need it and avoid performing the work till somebody asks for it. We wanted to make sure that we had sound crew assignments and that we were securing reliable commitments for that. And the idea of measuring commitment reliability with % plan complete and then identifying common causes for misses, that seemed like great sense to a lot of us. A little less obvious to me, at least in the early days, was the focus on limiting work in process and coordinating great handoffs. So as a couple of projects into it, we started really focusing on how good the handoffs were between people. And by the way, there's a lot more been written about this. You can think the latest, maybe the most complete version is the Glenn Ballard and Iris Tomline paper about the current benchmark. So if you're doing a really good job of the last planner system, you may not have much of the problems I'm going to talk about, but I don't think it completely eliminates it. So what I'm talking about is considering both sides of a handoff. So actually, the last planner system, and a lot of folks who do it, and even the work-based planning folks, they actually do a pretty good job of committing to do the work. On the other side, we need to find out how many people are using what they've asked for. So the commitment to use the work. And I think that doing this avoids the things I've started phrasing as phantom demand and futile hurry, of people asking for much more than they needed, and then people rushing to do things that no one's asked for. So if we can consider that, I think we'll make the project better for people. And for a long time, I've been an advocate of flow. I'm always talking about flow. And James Chu pointed out, you need to explain what flow you're talking about. So that's a good idea. So one thing all of us think about is the workflow. And that's the progress towards the milestone. And that's the focus of most of the full planning sessions. It's mostly like owners, construction managers, general contractors. I'm seeing this from the perspective of a general contractor and a construction integrator, the person who's there to get the job done for the owner. But it didn't take me very long to figure out that if I wanted to have good workflow, I needed good crew flow. And that is the trade, I call it crew flow instead of trade flow because it's specific to crews, not trades really. And that's the steady, predictable flow of work for crews, and it's essential for contractor success. And what I'll say is no matter what they commit to and talk about here, they're going to manage for this because they have to. And so one of the things I learned to do pretty early was go talk to the key trade contractors and basically ask them, what is it that you wish I understood? How can I help you? And then we would arrange our production plans and schedules the best we could to enable a very smooth workflow. The quick thing is we often found we could do the job with a lot fewer people if we did that. So next here, everyone hates to see people standing around. Everyone is tired when they're not sensing progress. When there's not progress, the one word that comes to mind every time is waiting. And there have been lots of efforts to address this problem, but I don't think very many are really addressing the underlying causes. Production science, operation science, rather, certainly helps address some of those underlying causes. And then here's maybe the most useful thing I'll say today is if you see a lot of crew waiting, it might be because you've hired a lot more folks than you really needed had you been managing for crew flow. So a few realities that shape the conversation is one, that there are actually countless value streams and flows, and they are both independent yet interdependent. And getting those all synchronized so nothing is waiting is futile. And one thing I've also found out, and at least on the projects I was watching, pure flow or pure pull and continuous flow are very rare. But where they're important, they're very important. But that usually represents a small number of the direct handoff chain exchanges. And so the buffers can either help us achieve this balance of balancing workflow and crew flow, or they can clog up the system. And then the whole thesis of this thing is if we focus on the most important handoffs and establishing a reasonable but not excessive set of buffers, we can simultaneously improve both workflow and crew flow and do it with fewer people. So we would do this by focusing on the handoffs that are really handoffs. And that's find the handoffs where someone is immediately going to use what somebody else has produced. And if no one is going to be using what you're producing, question is this now really the right time to go do this? The last planner system all along said, hey, should we be doing this? I'm just trying to make it a little more explicit because I have sat through countless planning meetings where people make very reliable promises to do work that no one's asking for. So yeah, they'll give you a high PPC, but it may not do anything to improve your project flow as we go through. The other thing you'll do is help folks avoid the opposite problem, which is committing the same resources several times. I had to convince several, particularly the smaller trades who were supporting many different parts of the projects, that there's a big difference between I can support any of these things you're asking and I can support all of these things you're asking. So it's also fairly common to watch folks make more commitments than they had the capacity to deliver. And so this is another big question to bring out in the paper. And another pretty useful thing. Why would you work overtime or spend extra money to do something that's not going to be used immediately? Why would I work Saturday if no one's going to use the work on Monday or Tuesday? And there are, of course, some reasons to go do that. But we've saved a lot of overtime premium pay just by asking that basic question. So getting into this, it usually involves, dealing with a couple of big misconceptions. I think the biggest misconception I get as I'm explaining lean type thinking to people and introducing it is last responsible moment. And the key word is responsible. It's, of course, critical to pull planning. We need to know when does it need to be done. But that in no way encourages putting everything off to the last possible moment or the last feasible moment. I use in the paper that accompanies this presentation, I use an example of going to the airport. I know if I leave my home about 2.5 hours for flight time, I can deal with some unfavorable traffic and I'll have a nice buffer to get a snack when I get there, not have to rush. Now, and so that 2.5 hour duration helps define my last responsible moment for leaving for the airport. Now, if I'm willing to break traffic laws and park in the short-term parking lot or leave my rental car at the curb, and then hope that I make it to the plane, well, I might be able to leave my house at 90 minutes before flight time and still make it, but that would be an irresponsible time. So by no means are we saying put everything off to the last minute. Just understand what the last responsible minute is. The other one is there's a lot of uncertainty about how things really take. And I'm observing that we're really not very good often, particularly on the first time we're doing something, at predicting how long it's going to take. And sometimes I've looked in the eyes of the people and recognized they just don't know. and they can't know. And so recognizing for that, it makes some adjustments. For the tasks that would have what I would call mutual PPC, or those tasks where someone's going to use what you're doing as soon as you get it done, we take a little extra care to, hey, how long is that duration going to be? And if you don't know, let's make our contingency plan so that you let us know when you know more, so we can make that handoff. So the incoming or the next runner is watching for the incoming runner and adjusting when he takes off based on what he sees. The other thing that says is maybe we don't push you so hard. If no one's going to use it when you get done, and again, I'm the construction integrator looking for workflow, I don't have to push you so hard for that reliable commitment, because otherwise you might just put some buffer in. Through here. So the mutual PPC concept is really pretty simple. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's simple because this is the familiar old system from the last planner. And all I'm doing is adding both the will do and the will use conversation. And this, of course, this applies much more broadly than just the weekly planning meeting. You should probably, that's also part of your pull planning efforts all through the conversation. But here, this helps you identify, hey, for this week, what percentage of those are going to be? And what I've discovered is it's pretty small percentage. It's usually, even on a job where we were, rushing towards or doing the best we could to pull in a very, very difficult first product date, I was mapping and measuring how many of the commitments that we made, the will do, how many of the will do's had a corresponding will use. And even during the busiest part of the project, it was only about a third. So more work was going into queues, at least for a bit, than not. Recognizing which tasks those are and that's what we would focus on. So let's talk about that project for a second. This was a bet the company project. It was a little bit smaller company, but it was a very substantial industrial project. They were using brand new technology. They had a customer who couldn't wait to get their product, and they'd kind of promised that customer they could have that product at about this time. Out here, I'm showing you on a schedule and the planned date. And the whole idea was that we were engaged. We had hired the team of trade partners. We had gone through the collaborative design and scoping process. We were working out the budget. Meanwhile, the client had a pilot plant, and they were waiting for the process to get completely through so they could validate their test results. And then that would release us to go finish the detailed design, do construction, and have fiber ready to ship about April of the following year. Well, as it turned out, it didn't work out that way. It turned out that the pilot process didn't work, and the customer had to completely reconfigure the abatement portion of the process. And this is not like making some adjustments. This is completely different process technology. And so that, of course, we didn't actually have the process design done until like February of the completion year, which of course we got a little later start on design, but design couldn't finish. We can't finish the design until they finish the process. Construction got a little bit later start, but we made up some of that. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this was we got the first fiber out about 2 weeks later than we expected. So we pulled that out. It's pretty minor miracle type thing. And how did that happen? Well, one is we had a no blame culture with everyone focused on helping the customer, and a customer who was welcoming the help. And the customer themselves did a great job in this final stage, because the other secret sauce is the transition from construction to startup and commissioning was flawless. We taught them and worked together, created a Kanban system so the systems would go through, and a team that had never started up a plant before using brand new technology got through the startup to deliver this miracle result. It's sort of like if you're a golfer, it's sort of like they got up and down from 200 yards out to save par. The other thing that we had, of course, extraordinary effort by the site team and the Jacobs site manager who was out there. And then we didn't spend any time at all comparing our earned value to what we thought the earned value would be. We didn't spend any time at all comparing plan to actual. And we had a major focus on adapting to what was happening now. And we were using this pull thinking and mutual PPC thinking throughout here. It doesn't matter where we thought we'd be, where are we going? We didn't get the big cost savings that we hoped we would, but we did hit the target cost. And then if you look at this, that's kind of a miracle. And the customer was very, very happy. And so that is another indication, that making sure you can use only what you need is it has a very powerful effect. So I started out with safety. I'm going to kind of wrap up and give Gary some flexibility here, and it's time to say, hey, putting people into a lousy production system is ineffective, unnecessary, costly, and most of all, disrespectful. So if it really sucks to make people work all weekend for things that weren't necessary, or to ramp people up. You get way more people on the job site than you really need, and then yell at them for standing around. So I'll kind of wrap up there and let Gary take over with whatever questions or comments or corrections he might have.
All right. Well, we got a question here for you, John. That was very insightful, by the way. Well, actually, the comment says, very insightful, John. What is your perspective on the difference between direct and indirect resource mobilization? Is there a tendency to prematurely mobilize one versus the other?
My instinct is the indirect staff, your engineering, your planning staff. I think that's what you're talking. If that's what you're talking about, the tendency there is to mobilize them way too late because you think that's a cost. And so setting up the production system part of the way, by the way, we don't have time to talk about all the strategies, but part of the way you level out this manpower so much is finding out the things you need to get started sooner, so you don't have to ramp up on such a steep manpower curve. The other thing that I would comment on the direct side is we tend to overman the project. If we think that we're getting behind, we add more people. Well, don't add more people if the people you've got are standing around. Let's go solve the production problem first. Then what you'll find out is you don't need to hire all those folks.
Yeah, that's that
Do
was
you think I got it there? Do you think that addressed the question, Gary?
I think it does. We'll find out if for Jim, you asked the question. If that didn't answer your question, please let us know. So another question for you: can you describe the ideal types of buffers in a construction project?
Yeah. Well, the one I'm going to I can't. There's countless. One I'm going to talk about is basically workable backlog. And one of the insights I figured out as a rule of thumb is, as we went through the planning meetings, I was looking at the number of tasks that had for workable backlog, the available work, and then the promised work. I wanted to make sure that the promised work never represented more than 50 to 60% of the crew's capacity. So if you looked at their, how many hours they had to work, you only wanted to see them committing to about half of that. So if you saw them committing to more than that, you knew they were probably going to fail someplace. And so that's how I would actually challenge them. Which of these commitments really matter and which ones really don't need to be commitments this week? But on the other hand, you need to have at least another 50 to 70 or 80% of capacity that's released. So you have plenty of work in front of them. And this was just golden for us on a major microelectronics process. When I introduced workable backlog, this is like in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, it has dramatically helped the crews so they would have some buffer to go do. We actually learned that, too much of a good thing is just another bad thing. So there are limits to how much workable backlog you see. And if you are looking at crews and you see some crew with enormous amounts of backlog in front of them, that probably tells you that somebody upstream could slow down.
Right.
Again, that answers the question, but I took a shot at it.
Good. And by the way, Jim did say you answered his question well.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Another question for you. You've talked about the danger of having too much work in process. What happens if you don't have enough?
Well,
And how do you determine what's the right level?
Yeah. Well, the point I was going to make in one of the slides I forgot to is when I'm asking the crews, what you wish I understood. The one thing your trade crews are always doing is they are trying to balance this critical balance between being overwhelmed and starved for work. Okay, and so if you don't have enough, you're starved for work. And that's why I say during that process, you're intentionally looking. And if I was a management from a management perspective, that's why I would be looking for as many crews as I could, is this balance of how much workable backlog do they have for this week and next week, and how fast are they going to burn through that, and how much are they promising? Because you also want to make sure that they're committing to enough that they're going to use their crew capacity. It's not like we're just out here to be nice to everybody. We're just trying to give them a fair shot at being successful.
So when would creating a stock of something instead of flow be more practical?
Well, I think the pandemic showed us that pretty well. Is you have to have enough stock to absorb the variability. I mean, that's as I understand, and some of the folks on this call are much better prepared to answer this than I am, but buffers are kind of like shock absorbers. And the rougher the terrain you're going over, the more shock absorber you need. So the more variation and uncertainty we have, the more buffer you need. And if you're doing a really good job of tack planning and you have a job that's got that degree of standard work, well, you might be able to commit more than that 50 to 70% of your capacity that I was talking about. But the amount of buffer is just a function of the amount of variation. And I think some of our other experts here might actually help explain that better.
So if we go back to your, maybe one more question here, as we get something from the audience, you triggered a thought. If we go back to you, back up to your slide about the will use.
Okay.
Go back.
Yeah, my clicker.
You're lovely. Okay, go down again. Oh, right there. Okay. So in your experience, this must change who's in the room when you're doing the planning. Can you talk about that?
Oh yeah. Well, you certainly have the performers. You also have the customer. You have the customer that wants what you're going to produce in the room with you. And this is golden because now they understand what's really going on. In fact, on the project I said where we had the miracle recovery at the end by using this kind of thinking, the customer was the biggest advocate. He was the biggest one who understood this. Both of our customer PMs really understood this concept, really supported me in doing this. And I think that was the most important thing. No, you're not helping me by working overtime to get this foundation done when the thing that's going to sit on it's not going to show up for 6 weeks.
I'm not going to use it. Yeah. All right. Very, very insightful, John. Thank you so
Hope
much
that's useful. Thanks.
for taking the time to write the paper. It's an excellent paper.